It's 1880, and you're all alone. All alone except for one large canine skull. Your husband, an Oxford professor, found the skull at the bottom of a lake and decided to bring it back to your cottage in Merioneth, Wales. I don't know how you'd feel about this, and maybe you wouldn't feel anything at all, until the scratching begins. You hear it from the living room, the harsh, incessant sound of something raking against the wood of the kitchen door, accompanied by heavy, inhuman breathing. You take a few cautious steps towards the kitchen window and peer out into the darkness. And something moves. Two large clawed paws slam into the window pane. You flinch at the ungodly screeching noise of nail meeting glass. In the dim lamplight, you can see its jagged teeth glinting and saliva drooping down its lupine maw. Its red-ringed eyes are bestial yet somehow still human in shape, set in the forehead of a man. Your mind can barely comprehend the half-human, half-dog thing glaring at you. All you can do is stare and whimper until the thing disappears, as though it was never there at all. Chapter 1. The Dogman Horror of the Valley. This is not the end of the story. The professor and his friend soon return from their walk and immediately arm themselves. Eventually, in the early hours of the morning, they chase this half-wolf, half-man creature away, and it disappears like a ghost into the lake. The next day, the professor throws the canine skull back into that same lake, and they never see this phantom wolfman again. The moral of this story is simple. If you find a large dog skull at the bottom of a lake, don't take it home. And always bring weapons on holiday in case of werewolf attacks. I found this story of the unnamed Oxford professor and his also unnamed wife in a book published in 1933, which was originally called The Werewolf. Unfortunately, the author of this book, the Reverend Montague Summers, was quite a controversial figure in his time. He was a divisive literary critic who wrote several books on the occult and who may or may not have been pretending to be a Catholic priest. In The Werewolf, Summers dedicates a whole chapter of his book to werewolves in England, Wales, Scotland and Ireland, and my favourite part is when he goes on a long anti-car tirade, claiming that automobiles are making Britain just as difficult and dangerous to travel as it was when wolves roamed the land. Rest in peace, Reverend Montague Summers. You would have hated the M25 and background checks, but you probably would have loved Ted Kaczynski. But then again, with a name like Montague Summers, you sort of have to dedicate your life to the occult and pretending to be a Catholic priest. That's just basic nominative determinism, like how my parents named me Cambrian Chronicles. Anyways, I wondered where this Phantom Wolfman story came from, and Summers was only mildly unhelpful. In the main text, he claims that this story was at some point related to him, but in the footnotes he does admit that it might be the same story as told in a 1932 issue of the British magazine The Passing Show, under the title of Exploring the Uncanny, Number 4, The Terror in the Mountain. This was written by a man with an equally unusual name, J. Wentworth Day, and I checked the other 3 previous Exploring the Uncanny segments, and they were also all written by the same man, and included such titles as Black Dogs and Phantom Birds, Speed King's Spirit Warnings, and Men, Wolves and Leopard Murders. It took me a while to find Wentworth's version of the story, but I finally found it in a 1980s horror anthology reprint, and it has been renamed The Dogman Horror of the Valley, which, coincidentally, is what my parents originally wanted to call me. This story begins with a brief history of the werewolf in Europe, where the author says that the most recent case of a suspected werewolf in Britain is the Merioneth example, which was seen by an Oxford professor, his wife, and guest in the 80s, as in the 1880s. The story is then basically the same as told by Summers in the 1930s, and then again by me, the real Dogman Horror of the Valley in the 2020s. Wentworth continues by talking about his travels, name-dropping clearly made-up people like Lord Beaverbrook and the Prime Minister of Newfoundland, before making some very racially loaded remarks about the various native inhabitants of the Americas, or as he puts it, the land that God forgot. Anyways, he ends the story by claiming the wolf in England vanished when the great medieval forests were cleared. It lingered until long after in Scotland, Ireland and Wales, and the last werewolf was seen, so they say, in that lonely cottage on a night of paralysing fear, when old men alive today were young boys. What a fun way to say in the past. Chapter 2. The Last Wolf in Britain. There's a long history of who killed the last wolf tales throughout Britain. A lot of them are hoaxes or anachronistic, but all of them make me sad. I don't want to write about who killed the last wolf because I like wolves. I currently have big plans to replace the London tubes with roaming packs of wild wolves, but someone claiming to be the mayor of London is getting in my way. Unfortunately, many people in this world are anti-wolf, and especially anti-werewolf, like King James VI/1, who wrote about the werewolves in his Daemonology. He thought that real werewolves didn't exist. Instead, he had the much more reasonable explanation that men suffering from melancholy could sometimes become so deluded that they would convince themselves that they were wolves and get down on their hands and knees and head out into the street and try to eat women and fight dogs. This guy was king. This idea of lycanthropy as a kind of madness is quite common in a lot of post-medieval Christian texts. Take for example Reverend S. Baring Gould's The Book of Werewolves, being an account of terrible superstition, which was published in 1865. You might recognize the name S. Baring Gould. He comes up in a lot of my videos and apparently he was inspired to write a werewolf book by an experience he had in France, when some local villagers didn't want to let him walk back to his lodgings alone at night because of a loup-garou. I personally don't speak French as I'm legally not allowed to, but apparently loup-garou means wolf-werewolf. And if that's not clear enough, one of the villagers supposedly described this creature as a fiend, a worse than fiend, a man fiend, a worse than man fiend, a man-wolf fiend, which I hope is one day on my gravestone. Thankfully, S. Baring Gould wasn't afraid of werewolves or historical inaccuracies, and so he picked up a big stick to use as a weapon and headed home. Eventually, he wrote this half-werewolf, half-true crime book describing a variety of madmen, including people who thought they were werewolves, as well as cannibals and serial killers. But the thing about this book that stood out to me was S. Baring Gould's claim that there were very few werewolves in English folklore, because wolves went extinct in England during the time of the Anglo-Saxon kings. But that's not quite right. Some Anglo-Saxon kings certainly seemed to try and eradicate wolves. For example, one made a Welsh king pay him a tribute of 300 wolf pelts a year. And according to William of Malmesbury, this ended after 3 years because there were no wolves left. But I guess they just weren't looking hard enough, because wolves continued to be a problem into at least the early medieval period in England and Wales, and much later in more remote parts of Scotland and Ireland. But there's definitely a relative lack of werewolf stories in British folklore, especially in comparison to mainland Europe. A good example of this comes from Gervais of Tilbury. In the early 13th century, Gervais wrote a book which had a lot to say about werewolves, and he even claimed that werewolfism was a well-known phenomenon in England. He then tried to prove this by using examples of French werewolves. So either Gervais was really bad at geography, or he was betting on the outcome of the 100 Years' War about 2 centuries early. Either way, he didn't actually have any stories to tell us about English werewolves, and unfortunately my cravings for wolfmen cannot be satisfied by French tales. So I've decided to retreat back to where I'm most comfortable, in medieval Welsh history. And where else to start my search for Welsh wolfmen than in the most famous Welsh text of all, the Mabinogion. Chapter 3. The Wolf People of the Mabinogion. The Mabinogion is a collection of Welsh medieval folktales, taken from manuscripts dating back to the 14th and 15th centuries, though the stories themselves are probably much, much older. The first story I want to talk about is in the 4th branch of the Mabinogion, and it concerns 2 brothers, Gilvaethwy and Gwydion. One of the brothers is yearning after the king's foot maiden, and I don't know how else to phrase that. For some freaky reason, the king of the kingdom, Math, always has to keep his feet in the lap of a maiden woman. The only exception is when he is at war. Realizing this, the brothers hatch a plot to separate the king from his maiden. They tell King Math that another man has come into possession of some strange new creatures. They're small animals whose flesh tastes better than beef, and they're called moch. To be clear, this is a pig origin story. With the king's permission, Gilvaethwy and Gwydion travel to this king's court at Ceredigion to ostensibly make a trade, but the brothers instead trick him and steal his pigs. War swiftly breaks out, and with King Math distracted, the brothers assault the maiden. Once the war is over, King Math discovers the men's crimes, and he rightfully decides to punish them. King Math uses his magic wand to turn Gilvaethwy into a hind and Gwydion into a stag. He then curses the brothers to live as animals in the wild, and for an extra freaky reason, he also curses them to mate with each other. After 1 year, the brothers return to King Math with a fawn, aka their newborn son. Math transforms the fawn into a human boy and sends him off to be baptized. Meanwhile, he turns the brother lovers into a boar and a sow and sends them off for another year. Eventually, they return to the king with a piglet son, who is also turned into a human boy and baptized. For their third and final year of this punishment, King Math turns the brothers into wolves, and they, of course, produce a wolf cub. This wolf cub is again turned human and baptized with the name Blaethyn. There's some confusion over what this name means. The most common translation of werewolf in Welsh is Blaedd Dyn, which combines the words for wolf and man. Many take Blaethyn to be a variation of this, meaning wolfman or wolf cub, but Davis, who translated my copy of the Mabinogion, believes that Blaethyn in this instance actually means dark red wolf. Chapter 4. The Other Wolf People of the Mabinogion. The second instance of wolf-related antics in the Mabinogion occurs in the story of Culhwch ac Olwen. The premise is that the titular hero, Culhwch, has to complete a series of extremely difficult tasks in order to marry a princess named Olwen. These tasks aren't set by her, they're set by her father, who is fated to die on the day she marries, which is one way to make your child's wedding day all about yourself. Culhwch fortunately has help with his Herculean labours from his famous cousin, none other than King Arthur. Arthur and his men soon set out to find Rhymni, a she-wolf, and her 2 lupine sons, Gwyddryd and Gwydden Astris. This isn't actually one of the tasks set by Olwen's dad, they just decide to do this, I guess as a side quest. When Arthur and his men finally track down Rhymni and her whelps, they surround the wolves, but before any blood can be shed, God steps in and returns them to their human forms. We're not actually told in this story why they were turned to wolves in the first place, or why they needed to be turned back into people, or what happened to them afterwards. There's actually another version of this story, written by 14th century Welsh poet called Iolo Goch, but in a lot of ways it's just as vague. In a poem dedicated to Saint Dewi, the patron saint of Wales, Goch describes 2 brothers, Gwydre and Odryd, and their unnamed mother, being turned into wolves by God because of some unknown sin they committed. So we still don't actually know what they did to insult God in the first place, but after living as wolves for some time, Saint Dewi returned them to their human forms, which is apparently something he could just do. I like these stories quite a lot. I think it's an interesting concept, that if you do something awful and inhumane, then you'll be relegated to the animal world, to become the beast that you are on the inside. It also reminds me of my favourite werewolf story, back from when I was a young dog man, before I had the chance to horrify any valleys. And that's the story of Lycaon, the Greek king who offended Zeus by offering him human flesh. The sources vary on who he sacrificed and how and why, and whether he was a zealot or an egomaniac or maybe just bored, but I like Ovid's version of this myth, where Lycaon is a part of the Iron Age of humanity, where men are corrupt and cruel and awful and Jupiter is sick of it. And Lycaon plotting to feed him human flesh and kill him in his sleep is reasonably the last straw. So he destroys Lycaon's home, turns him into a wolf, and sends a flood to wipe out humanity. Chapter 4. Arthur and the Dogheads. The story of Rhymni and her whelps is not the only Arthurian story which contains werewolves. I was actually surprised to find that there are multiple werewolves in the Arthurian canon. Outside of Wales, there's a French tale about an Arthurian knight named Merioneth, who uses a magic ring to turn into a wolf so that he can hunt down a stag for his wife. However, as soon as he transforms, his wife steals the ring and returns to her home country of Ireland. Dismayed, Merioneth follows her to Ireland, where he remains as a wolf until Arthur arrives in the country and realizes what has happened. Arthur takes back the ring and returns Merioneth to his human form. There are other stories, but again, we're talking about French werewolves, where I want to talk about Welsh werewolves. There's an early Welsh poem from the Black Book of Carmarthen called Pa Gyr, where Arthur has to convince a porter to let him and his companions through. He tells the porter about all of his heroic deeds which he and his men accomplished, and one of the things he lists is fighting the Dogheads at a place called Trevroyd. During this battle, Arthur and his companion Bedoe fought Garw Lloyd, who could be interpreted as the leader of the Dogheads. This Garw Lloyd also appears in multiple Welsh triads about the 3 fortunate slayings. Unfortunately for Garw Lloyd, in all of them he is the slayed, not the slayer. Apparently he had to be killed due to his unfortunate habit of slaying 7 Welshmen a week, with 2 on Saturday so that he wouldn't have to kill any on Sunday, a loophole that the church apparently won't teach you. In the triads, his full name is Gwrgi Garw Lloyd, which could mean something close to rough grey man hound, and his association with the Dogheads in Pagir has led some historians to suggest that he might have been envisioned as some kind of werewolf or dog-man hybrid. But the most explicit Arthurian werewolf tale is definitely Arthur and Gorlagon. I hadn't actually heard of this text before I started researching Welsh wolfmen, which is a shame because it's probably the best story I've ever heard in my long, loathsome life. But it's not massively surprising that I'd never heard of it before, because it's only survived in one manuscript, and it's so bizarre that a lot of historians have just written it off over the years. But the few that have studied Arthur and Gorlagon think that it might have been some sort of short drama intended to be performed in Welsh border courts in the late medieval period, which is very specific. The basic premise is that Arthur is on a quest to find out why his wife doesn't love him, and on this quest he meets a king named Gorlagon, who tells him a story about another king who was turned into a wolf by his scheming wife. There are multiple twists and turns in this story, including the reveal of an embalmed head at the dinner table, which makes the plot quite convoluted. I actually think I'm going to do a separate video on this story at some point, just because it's the strangest Arthurian tale I've ever come across and the whole thing is so bizarre. But for now, we'll hear Gorlagon's story about the king turned wolf. Essentially, when the king was born, a sapling began to grow in the royal gardens, and it was fated that if anyone cut down the sapling and hit the king over the head with it, while saying, "Be a wolf with the mind of a wolf," then he would become a wolf with the mind of a wolf. Bear in mind, the king apparently did nothing to deserve this other than being born. The sapling just appeared. Unbeknownst to the king, his wife was in love with a local pagan prince, so when she found out about the sapling, she decided to get rid of her husband once and for all. But unfortunately for her, she messed up the curse. Instead of saying, "Be a wolf with the mind of a wolf," she said, "Be a wolf with the mind of a man." The king was then transformed into a wolf and his own hunting dogs chased him from the castle grounds. The queen thought she'd seen the last of him, but because of her error, he still retained his human mind, and he then chose to spend his time making cubs with a local she-wolf and terrorizing his ex-wife and the new pagan king. To reiterate, he still had the mind of a human being when he ran off to mate with wolves. Eventually, he was chased out of the kingdom he had once ruled and into the land of his neighbour, his brother. Actually, 2 of his brothers are local kings, and it seems like neither of them had noticed that their brother had been usurped, or neither of them cared enough to do anything about it. I like the second option better, but only because the Wolf King is eventually chased off into the kingdom of his second brother, and while he's still a wolf, he ends up bonding with his brother. And pretty soon, this brother realizes that the wolf which he has befriended is too smart to just be an animal, so therefore must be a man who's been cursed. The brother swears to help return his wolf friend to human form, which also suggests that he would rather help out a sort of smart wolf instead of noticing his own brother's disappearance. He then summons his army and sets sail, trusting the navigational skills of this wolf to lead the flotilla to his home country, and if I was one of the soldiers, this is the point where I might have considered a mutiny. But they soon land on the shores of the Wolf King's kingdom and find the people distraught. The pagan prince has turned out to be an awful ruler, and they lament what has happened to their old king. Together, the wolf and his brother, who must have realized at this point that his wolf friend is in fact his long-lost brother, confront the queen. They ultimately have her tortured to find out the location of the sapling. She relents, and the sapling is used to transform the wolf back into his original human form. Except now, Gorlagon tells us that he is incredibly handsome. This text has a lot of parody in it, and was supposed to be comical as well as macabre, so it's probably not too fair to take the more bizarre plot points out of context, but then again, they are just as bizarre when read within the context of the manuscript, so maybe all is fair in Love and Wolf. Of course, the final twist is the best. Gorlagon reveals that he was the king who had been transformed into a wolf all along, seemingly not noticing or caring that he just told a complete stranger that he spent a significant chunk of his life fully conscious mating with wolves in the Welsh countryside. Chapter 6: Saints and Wolves. The final Wolfman story for today is told by my favourite medieval Welsh author, Gerald of Wales. In his Topography of Ireland, he tells the story of a priest travelling between Ulster and Meath, accompanied by a young boy. One night, they're at their campsite and they're approached by a wolf. To their surprise, the wolf begins to speak. The wolf replies that he was cursed by Saint Natalis to take on the form of a wolf. This wolf and a she-wolf, both of them natives of Ossory, share this fate. For every 7 years, they have to leave the human world and become wolves, and after those 7 years, if they survive and there are 2 others to take their place, they can rejoin the human world. Unfortunately, the she-wolf is on the verge of death, and the male wolf begs the priest to give her her last rites. The priest is uncertain, but he follows the male wolf. He finds the she-wolf in the hollow of a tree, sighing and groaning like a human would. The priest gives her all her proper rites, except the last communion. He's hesitant to continue, and seeing this, the male wolf uses his claw to tear the she-wolf's skin, revealing an old woman underneath. The priest is so freaked out by this that he continues with the communion, and once he's done, the male wolf recovers the old woman in her wolf skin. The next day, the wolf leads the priest out of the forest, and the priest asks him whether the hostile race which has now landed on the island would stay there, and the wolf replies that these invaders are a punishment from God for the sins of the Irish. As a general rule of thumb, I don't think it's a good idea to count on talking wolves for reliable political commentary. And it's also probably worth mentioning that Gerald of Wales wrote the Topography of Ireland as part of his job as a royal chronicler during the reign of Henry II, and that he was part of Prince John's invasion of Ireland, which is probably why Talking Wolf tells the priest that these foreign invaders, aka the English, will continue to hold Ireland as long as they stay Christian and God-fearing. Although I personally think the moral of this story is to be wary of wolves, as they may contain the elderly. Chapter 7. The Last Werewolf. I like werewolves. I like werewolves a lot, much more than my son, and just a little less than my channel. But there is an argument to be made that most of the wolf men and women that I've talked about in this video are not werewolves in the modern sense. Modern depictions vary massively from humans with sideburns and claws to strange dog-like creatures with elongated limbs and disturbing CGI to full-blown semi-realistic looking wolves. But the werewolves that we see nowadays in the media and sometimes in my garden tend to share a few recognizable features. They're usually humans who come from a lineage of werewolves or who've been bitten or scratched by another wolf, and they tend to transform back and forth from human to wolf. And whether this is controlled by the lunar cycle or by their own whims or emotions or some other external factor, they always seem to be swapping between these two forms. But werewolves were not always like this. As we can see from the illustration of S. Baring Gould's book, the werewolf in this picture is just a wolf. And the majority of the wolf people I've talked about today don't really fall into the modern classification. Merioneth transforms to and from a wolf using a magic ring, and Gorlagon could do the same if someone was around to keep hitting him with that magic sapling. But most of these stories usually involve men and women who've been cursed to take on the form of a wolf for an extended period of time, like Rhymni, Gilvaethwy, and Gwydion. These aren't cases of lycanthropy, these are instances of shapeshifting. These aren't modern werewolves, they are wolf people who turn into actual wolves. The only exception would probably be the dog heads, but only really because we don't know what a dog head is. Sure, it sounds pretty explanatory, but I have a lot of follow-up questions like, why do they have a dog head? What breed of dog head do they have, and what does the rest of them look like? The Dogman horror of the valley certainly made its monster sound much more like a modern werewolf. A beast's eyes set in the skull of a man who possesses the frame of a human and the claws of a wolf, but even this differs wildly to modern day ideas of a werewolf. There's no moon transformations or edgy teenage angst, but instead this wolfman is inexplicably tied to the presence of a large canine skull found at the bottom of a lake in rural Wales, cursed to haunt whoever fishes it up. Ultimately, however, I think that's what makes all of these stories so interesting, how different they are to our modern ideas of wolfmen. The people of medieval Wales did not imagine Arthur confronting a tortured creature with abs cursed by moonlight, but instead a woman converted to the animal kingdom as a punishment by God. Gorlagon never gained supernatural strength and a human wolf appearance. Instead, he turned into an actual wolf, was mistaken for one by his brother, and was able and willing to mate with wolves in the wild. Regardless, I hope you liked my list of some of the wolf people who I could find in medieval Welsh folklore. Only one question remains. Werewolf? Oh. Their wolf. Thank you for watching.